The Quantitative Research Paper, Chapter 8, A Guide to Writing Sociology Papers. So one of the questions that often plagues undergrads in sociology is what is the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research? In this lecture, I'm going to review the quantitative approach to research in sociology. I'm sure not everyone has taken the research methods course yet, but either way, it's important to know the general features of both quantitative and qualitative research so you can best write the methods section for your paper in this course. So quantitative research is typically used to answer macro or large-scale questions or to examine general patterns in society. Quantitative simply means of a measurement based on a quantity or number, right? So hint, it's always going to have numbers involved, right? So quantitative approach involves creating and organizing numerical data to answer a sociological question. So in this audio, we're going to review the kinds of methodological approaches that produce numerical or statistical results that can either confirm or reject your research hypothesis. So when it comes to quantitative methods, it is much more formalized than qualitative methods, which is, hint, part of the reason I love qualitative. But anyway, so papers that are using a quantitative approach are often very structured and formal. So if you've ever taken stats or research methods, then you've heard about the null hypothesis, which is often a feature of quantitative sociological research, where you confirm or reject the hypothesis. So the null hypothesis basically assumes there's no relationship between the variables that you're studying. So you're trying to prove that false or trying to reject the null, right? Because we all love double negatives. So you want to reject the null hypothesis to demonstrate that there is a relationship between the variables that you're looking at. So like I said before, the paper in quantitative methods follows a specific format with 4 major sections, but of course add to those an introduction and conclusion section, as those are kind of assumed. So don't forget those importance because they are the bookends of your paper. But the 4 major sections it's talking about are the literature review, the methods, the results, and discussion. So we'll go through those in a bit. Okay, so first up, the literature review, right? It's of course the section where you review the literature related to your chosen topic. And in the paper for this course, I ask that you analyze as well as summarize in that section. So instead of just a list of facts, analysis shows us how the research connects to one another and explains what expectations and hypotheses you have for how the research will conclude once you've done the data collection or the methods part of your research. So again, for quantitative, this is pretty specific, or how variables react or relate. So for instance, what's the relationship between sleep and performance on a sociology exam? I would hypothesize that more sleep would correlate to better exam performance. In this case, I'm saying I think there will be a positive correlation between the 2 variables. So this is the kind of specificity you want for your final paper submission, because I'm going to be looking to see how you state your research question and your hypothesis. Specifically, is your research question testable, and does your hypothesis offer an explanation to answer that question? Okay, moving on to the second major section the book discusses, the methods section, which is generally divided into 3 subsections in quantitative research papers. So there is a sample in the book that gives you an idea of what this looks like as well. So the section is divided into, like I said, 3 subsections. The first is the sample, then the measures, and then procedures. Okay, so first up, sample. The sample is who you are doing your research on. This is different from your overall population. So the population is the larger group that you're studying, and the sample is the actual people in your research. So let's say I want to do research on sociology students who take Soc 308 courses. And I decided to give a survey to the 2 Soc 308 courses that I'm teaching this semester. Then my population is sociology students at Cal State Fullerton that take the writing course, but my sample is the students who actually respond to the survey in my classes. Right? So there's a difference, and you want to specify that sample. So for this section of your paper, specify who your population is and who your sample is. How did you select this sample? Who are they? Right? Why do they fit the scope of answering your question? Also in the methods section, you will discuss your measures. meaning which kind of sociological research method did you use and why did you use it? Remember, you're phrasing it as if it has been done for the final paper, even though clearly you're not actually doing the methods part, you're just proposing it, right? But you want to phrase it in that sort of way. So usually when it comes to what method did you use, it's kind of a duh, right? It's because, why did you use it? You thought it would work. You thought it would answer your question. That's why, right? So I'm going to go over some of the examples in a minute of different methods, such as using surveys or existing data. But really the important thing is you need to explain what approach you chose and why you think it fits. So if I said, I want to know how many students on CSU campuses face homelessness, so I'm going to distribute a survey to all CSU students to ask if they're unhoused or facing instability in their housing. So then I would say I'm going to distribute a survey to get the large population I'm trying to study, which is CSU students that are facing housing issues. So if my research question is how many students are facing those issues, then, and obviously giving out a survey means you can then look at demographics and see if there's any patterns in respondents that answered, right, that are facing housing instability, maybe gender, social class, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, any of those kind of other categories, maybe those things are related to who's facing these issues. So for the methods section, in this measures part, you have to just kind of explain why that answers your research question, right? So if my question is how many people are facing this, using a survey is a pretty good fit because the survey is going to look at large scale patterns and trends, right? If I said, I want to see how many people are facing this, so I'm going to do, a case study, that wouldn't make sense, right? Because a case study is usually looking at one person or one group, like a small set. So I wouldn't be able to extrapolate that to a larger population and apply that to my actual research question, right? So really all you have to do in this part is just kind of explain like, here's the approach I'm taking and here's why it answers my question, right? Then you have the procedures, which is a bit more of the kind of step-by-step of what was done. So like, let's say you have a survey. This would be the part where you would tell me what kind of questions were on the survey, right? What kind of themes they were looking at, give me sample questions, that kind of thing, right? So the procedures, again, are just what were the specific steps you took to make that happen? And again, in a hypothetical world where you actually do the research, that's what I mean by that, right? So you want details here. It's hypothetical, but it's still important to make it as realistic as possible so you can get the most from the experience of completing the paper in this class, right? And then traditionally, the next section of the paper would include the results and discussion section. So of course, you're not going to have those. Why? Because you're not actually doing the research. So I do think the sample in the book is helpful to give you an idea of the layout for these sections, but you're just going to skip the results and discussion because you don't have the data to do that part, right? But still, it's important to understand how it works. So the results section is where you put all your facts and figures and fun tables to explain who is being studied demographically and, any of the specific hypotheses or variables that you're looking at. And then in the discussion section is where you explore the meanings behind the tables and what information they imply. So these are important to know, but again, will not be part of your paper for this course since you're not actually doing the research part. You're just proposing that part for this class. It would be a long-ass class if I wanted you to do the methods part and give me the results. But if you're planning on going to grad school, then you could actually turn this paper into real research down the line, as several of my former students have done with the papers they constructed in this class. Okay, moving on to stating your hypothesis. So your hypothesis should be stated in a way that can be confirmed or rejected by the results, right? So the null hypothesis, as I said before. The null hypothesis assumes that there's no relationship between the variables you're examining. So you want to see if you can confirm or reject that hypothesis. So that's the wording you would use when discussing that. But again, your hypothesis is going to be an articulation of what you think is the logical answer to your research question, right? So your hypothesis needs to be stated to make relationships clear. Make clear how the variables are related. And if there's a relationship, what's the direction of that relationship? Is it a positive correlation, a negative correlation? Be clear about what you think about the relationships between those variables that you're studying when you're taking a quantitative approach. So an important thing to understand for quantitative research is the difference between a causal relationship and a correlational relationship. In a causal relationship, the independent variable is responsible for change in the dependent variable. So the one variable causes the change you see in the other variable. In contrast, a correlational relationship is when two variables are correlated in some way, right? They're related. It's not necessarily that one causes the other, but that they are happening in some relationship in tandem. So again, a positive correlation is when two things are related in a way that when one goes up, the other does as well. So positive correlation would be education level and income, right? A negative correlation is when one thing goes up, the other thing decreases, such as gang intervention. As more of those, programs help support children so that they don't end up in gangs in the first place, the levels of gang participation decreases, right? So when you're talking about those correlations, you have to be specific about, do you think it's a positive? Do you think it'll be a negative? Because again, you're making this hypothesis based on your informed idea of what you think will take place. But again, you don't know what will take place. That's the fun of doing the research, right? Also, the hypothesis should be stated to explain how the variables will be operationally defined, or the manner in which the variables will be measured. So for instance, let's say I want to study if eating food before class helps students do better in class, then I'd have to explain how I define the variables eating food and doing better in class. So I could define eating food as intake of any kind, or maybe as a full meal and not just a sugary vending machine snack. And I have to define doing better in the course, right? Does this mean being more attentive, higher scores on course assignments or exams? So there's not really a right or wrong. It's just about, you want to be specific within your research and say how those variables are being operationalized. So one reason that that's really important in research is because it often needs to be replicated or tested to be determined as valid. So you need to be clear about how each variable will be operationalized, even though it's a hypothetical study. Okay, so the method you choose to use for your paper depends on the hypothesis that you're testing, right? Because the method should test your hypothesis or answer your research questions. So if you're looking at macro issues or large-scale research, then you're using that quantitative approach. So it would not make sense to apply qualitative research methods, of which I'm going to go over in the other lecture, right? So what are some specific methods you could propose to use in your paper? Well, you could use archival sources. So if you're interested in birth and death rates or pre-existing data, like census data, the census is conducted every 10 years and has a bunch of info, which is why it's so often used in quantitative sociological research methods, especially demography. A benefit to archival sources is not facing the Hawthorne effect while conducting the research. Another potential method is structured observation. So depending on your paper's topic and your research questions, structured observation can be conducted in the lab or in the field. It's just guided by specific objectives and a set hypothesis. Then there's the experimental design, or the kind of research that you've heard of before, even if you never took a research methods course. It's the basic model of research that most often involves two groups, an experimental group and a control group. So the independent variable is given to the experimental group, but not the control group, to measure the exposure of the group to the independent variable. So, this is very commonly used in medical research, and that can be like an easy way to explain it, right? So in medical research, when they're testing new drugs, they'll give some people a real pill while they'll give another group a sugar pill, right? And so this is because people may be reactive when they realize they're being studied, and just taking the pill can cause what's called a placebo effect, where people think they're feeling the effect of the medication when it's really just their body reacting to that sugar pill. And their assumption that it's working is what makes it work, right? So this is pretty similar with sociological research. To have a control group is to measure the experimental group against one who did not receive the independent variable. So you can still see what impact the independent variable is having and what impact the research itself is having. So we do have to worry about the Hawthorne effect in research, right? Which I briefly mentioned before, but I didn't really explain it. It's the idea where people act differently since they know they're being researched. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon where basically this guy was trying to study effectiveness of workers. So he tried all these different variables. He turned up the lights, turned down the lights, gave them more breaks, gave them less breaks. No matter what he did, they were more productive. And then he realized it was him. It was the fact that, like, if someone came to your work with your boss and was like, I'm going to study how effective you are as a worker, you'd work a lot better, right? Because you want to look effective as a worker. So anyway, that's kind of that part of the Hawthorne effect, is people often can change sometimes their behavior a bit when they know they're being studied, right? So the way that they counteract that in experimental methods is to use that control group. Okay, so survey methods are a common quantitative research method that I'm sure you at some point have had to fill out a survey. They're popular as a method because they're easy to distribute, they're cheap to make and distribute as well, so they're often used, right? So survey methods, as an umbrella term, includes both questionnaires and interviews. So it is similar to the experimental design, with the survey is being used to kind of in line with the demographics to see what effects certain variables have on different groups. Another approach is secondary data analysis, where you use existing data and run new statistical analysis on that data to generate new findings. So there are so many great, rich sources of data that we can use as sociologists. There's the General Social Survey, for example, which asks the same questions year after year, so it can be helpful in measuring how attitudes have changed over time. There's a lot of these sources, right? Some of them are official data from government organizations, and then there's, one of my favorites is the Pew Research Center, right? And others like it that offer downloadable data sets that can be used for different kinds of analyses. So these you will use for projects in your statistics courses. Okay, and then the IRB is a necessary evil, right? That you need to conduct research, you have to submit your proposal to the IRB to be approved first. So the Institutional Review Board protects human experimentation. So that's why before you conduct the research, you have to get approved through them so they can make sure that you're not doing anything that's not ethical in your research. So you have to make sure you're not going to harm any of your participants before you can be approved. So this is something you're going to want to mention in your methods section of your paper. How do you intend to keep respondents' information confidential or anonymous? It's harder to get approved when doing controversial research or research with children, so keep that in mind as well. So, but again, it is essential that you plan for data collection before you conduct your research, so that you have an organized way to manage all of that data, right? Otherwise, if all of that information comes pouring in and you don't have an organized way to deal with it, that's going to cause chaos and the research is going to be a nightmare, right? So you have to plan for that data collection before you actually do any of it. That's part of why I make you do a methods section in this paper, but then not actually do the methods, right? So that you understand all the planning that goes into it before you actually get to pull that trigger and actually do the research. Okay, so some questions to address in your methods and analysis plan. So, I went over a little bit of this before, right? What population are you sampling? Describe the relevant characteristics of that population and sample. How did you select your sample, right? Was it a random sample? Was it, snowball sampling, convenience sampling, right? And again, so for samples, it's, again, what sampling technique you use is all about what fits your actual scope. So if you had something that you're trying to extrapolate to a larger population, like going back to that Cal State Village and homelessness example I gave, then it would make sense to do it as a random sample. Like, let's say I get the email address of every single CSU student, and I arbitrarily pick, okay, every 7th person gets an email for this survey, right? And those become the sample. Or, any other kind of randomly derived way to make sure that basically the random sample just means any person in that population has an equal chance of being selected. It's kind of like put all the names in a hat situation. So you don't have to necessarily do a random sample, but that is often, kind of the go-to standard within quantitative research if you want to extrapolate to a larger population, right? So again, you also want to address what measures are you using in your paper? How do you operationalize your variables, right? Did you already define what they mean and how you would measure them? And then do you need to develop a questionnaire or survey instrument? right? And for the purpose of this paper, you don't actually have to create the survey instrument itself. You would just give me the major topics or just like a few sample questions of the kind of things you would be asking. But I'm not expecting you to put like an appendix with that stuff. Okay, so when it comes to question construction, so you want to avoid using ambiguous terms and slang. You want to be as straightforward as possible because you want people to understand what they're being asked, right? You don't want them to have to fill in the blanks. You also want to avoid and or questions because they're asking more than one thing, which makes that very difficult when you're trying to set it up in a quantitative kind of yes or no mathematical sense, right? In a binary sense. So you want to, of course, avoid biased questions, right? That's the big one, which means thinking very critically about the wording and the way the questions are constructed so that you're not leading respondents to answer one way or another, which takes away from those research findings. Also, anonymity is very important. You need to explain how the person will not be identified. For instance, if I went to your job and asked you to fill out a survey about how you feel about working there, you may not want to fill that out, honestly, if you thought your boss might read it and know it was you that said it. So we need to make sure respondents know that their personal information will not be linked to the survey results or whatever, if we're using anything intrusive like a survey, so that they feel more comfortable divulging the real deal info that you want in your research that's going to get you some really interesting findings, right? So the more that you can protect people's, not just confidentiality, but really anonymity, the better, right? So confidentiality just means the people are known to me, but they're not known to others. But anonymity means I don't even know who answered that, right? And so that's what's really fun about things like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or some of these other like kind of survey softwares that are out there where, like, let's say I give you a link to a survey, you click on those answers, it just gives me a numerical code for you instead of linking it to your email address or any identifiable information. So I can assure you that your answers will be anonymous. I won't know who said what, right? So that's something that is very helpful to provide for people so that they feel comfortable, right? So that's something you might want to articulate in like a sentence in your method section. So you also want to provide instruction on how to answer the questions so that it's clear whether it's a Likert scale or fill in the blank. If you were doing a survey or any sort of questionnaire, you got to be specific. And then it has to be easy to read. Again, pretty straightforward. So you want to number it and be careful about the order of questions because you don't want to prejudice the findings of the research. And of course, you need to show respect for your respondents. So this also means not making the questionnaire crazy long, since that's expecting a lot from a participant to give so much of their time. I remember some years back when Cal State Fullerton put out this transportation survey, and being a sociology nerd, I know how much they want those results, so I stubbornly filled it out. But it just kept happening. Page after page after horrible, boring page of questions about parking, driving to campus, carpooling, etc. I never finished it because after about an hour of taking it, I realized it was like a Twilight Zone episode and it would never end, so I quit. So you need to be respectful of participants' time and their energy and not expect hours of their time without compensation or, in some way warning them ahead that this could take X amount of time, right? Okay, some more questions to address in that method section. How will you get the data into analyzable form, right? So if the data has to be represented numerically, how do you make that happen? Like, how do you take someone's survey response and turn that into a number? That's actually pretty easy typically, especially if you're using something like a Likert scale. A Likert scale you've definitely used, right? Likert scale is like strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, right? So a Likert scale, you could just apply a different numerical value, like scores 1 through 5, depending on the scale that you're measuring, right? So I remember this one I did in grad school a million years ago. It was like the feminist attitude scale. And so it would be like if you were for sure hated feminist, you would be at the 1 end, right? Like strongly disagree or whatever. And then if you were like super supportive, you'd be at the 5 end, right? Like woke. And then it gives you a range of scores so that you can kind of place each person's total score value within that range of, if there's 10 questions, so the possibility is a range of, from 10 points to 50 points, then if someone's scoring like 40 plus, you know that they're high on that feminist attitudes. If they're scoring like under 20, not so much, right? So it kind of gives you that way. You would just basically say, I'm going to use a Likert scale and apply X values to it or whatever it might be, right? So there are many ways to turn things that we would ask people, right, whether it's a survey or otherwise, or even archival data, into numerical form, right? It's just, it could be coding. There's many different ways to do this, but the idea is you just want to kind of express how you would go about doing that, right? And how would you analyze it? Like, what relationship are you looking at? Is it two variables? Is it more, right? What are you looking at in that analysis? Okay, so then what about writing the actual section for your paper, right? That's what you're here for. So touching upon what I talked about before, again, for your paper, for this class, you are going to describe your sample, right? It's important to specify the population you're studying and your sample. Are they Cal State Fullerton students, teens, registered voters? Discuss how you selected your sample from the overall population. Again, is it a random sample? And describe any relevant characteristics like age, size, etc. So again, it doesn't always have to be a random sample, because sometimes that doesn't make sense. Like, let's say I was going to do research on people who've experienced, let's say, violence or abuse within the foster care system, right? Then I can't send that survey out to everyone, because not everyone went through the foster care system, right? So sometimes a random sample doesn't make sense, because you need people that have a specific knowledge that lends to that. It's not about a right or wrong, really. It's just about how would you do this if you were doing this research? How would you explain it, right? And then again, describing your measures. How would you measure this information, right? Is it secondary sources? Are you taking the data in yourself? So the thing that gets me the most is people say, I'm going to look at stats. Okay, no, that's not a valid answer. You're going to make stats, right? That would be a much more valid response to that, right? So are you going to use existing data sources and, I'm going to use a two-tailed ANOVA or any of that crap? Like you want to be specific about how you would actually go about doing this process. Because again, that's the muscle that you're working through this whole class, is learning how to prepare yourself for this. And it's not just like, you're like, oh, I'm not going to grad school. What do I care about this? Well, do you want to be sold? Do you want to be a sheep? Like, no, you want to be able to critically think and look at research and determine whether or not it's BS. And that's an essential part of this process, right? Understanding the methodology, understanding how the research was done, especially sample and population, things like this, the measures, procedures, has everything to do with whether or not the research is valid or even really makes sense, the conclusions that they're trying to make. So this is something that just makes you a critical consumer of like humans, right? So it's definitely something you need to do. Anywho, back to rambling. So like let's say, oh, I'm going to do a survey, if that's your measure. Okay, cool. But like, what kind of survey? Are we talking structured, semi-structured? About how long would that take? About how many people are you interviewing, right? Would these things be face-to-face? Would they be, co-present? Would they be on the phone? Are they going to be audio recorded? If so, how are you going to manage that data? Meaning, the anonymity and the confidentiality, all that kind of fun stuff. So if you're using a questionnaire, is it open questions? Is it closed questions? What kind of questions are going to be on it, right? That's what I'm looking for in the paper. So again, with your procedure, same deal. You want to identify the method that you're using and the specific design that you would use of that method and kind of break that down. So, overall measures is much more about, the kind of umbrella of like, oh, I'm doing interviews and this is whatever. But then the procedure would be the very specifics of, okay, I'm going to contact X amount of people for this survey, and then after the survey is completed, I'm going to do a follow-up with X amount of people within this period of time, whatever it is, right? Again, it's all hypothetical, guys. You can be like, I'm going to interview them on the moon. No, I'm just kidding. Please make it realistic, right? You don't want to be like, I'm going to give a survey to, I don't know, 50,000 people and analyze that in a day. It's like, that's not going to happen. But, you just want it to be something that the scope of it is reasonable and not something that's so difficult to undertake that it would take like a huge research team to do it itself, right? So again, the sample in your book, I mentioned briefly before, it is a good resource on page 133. It gives you a layout that's appropriate to a quantitative method section, but remember, you're not going to need the results or discussion because you're not actually doing the research. So for the rest of it, though, it can give you an idea of what that looks like. It doesn't have to look exactly like that, right? It's just to give you some guidance, right? So you don't feel like you're adrift trying to figure this out yourself. And of course, I'm always a resource. Feel free to reach out, or, if you haven't done so yet, hit up that sociology writing tutor, right? That is what they're for. They will help you with this stuff. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what's expected within, at least for a quantitative research paper in this class.